In today's video, we're going to be discussing weaknesses in chess, whether those are weak squares, weak pawns, how to utilize those weak squares and pawns, and how to get dominant positions. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. Okay, let's start this video off by discussing this position right here. And what I want you to notice specifically about this position is the fact that the pawns around the black king are mostly, or not mostly, all of them are placed on light squares. That means that the dark squares are going to be very, very weak, especially because there is no dark square bishop for the black. White is the only one who has a dark square bishop in this position. That means that the bishop will be controlling this diagonal very, very well. And with the help of the queen, this king is going to be in a lot of trouble. So in this position, there are a couple of moves you can make. Let's just say we play queen to c1 to go queen c3 and line up this battery. And there's actually not much that black can do. Black should play f6 here, and after a move like queen to c3 or queen to f4, this pawn is under tremendous amount of pressure. You might have to defend it with rook to f8, but now the rooks are coming to the center, so we use these weak squares as a threat to win something else. In this case, we are winning the battle in terms of activity. Rook d1, the queen has to move. Let's say queen e7, rook e1. We are way more active than the black pieces, and we have targets here. So we didn't end up checkmating the black king necessarily. However, we used this threat of checkmating the black king with queen c1 and then potential ideas on queen g7. We used this as a threat in order to get a lot of activity and in order to secure a very nice active position. Once again, an attack does not necessarily have to end in a checkmate. You can use these weak squares as a threat in order to do something else in the position, because your opponent has to use resources in order to defend against the threat. Let's say queen c3, rook f8. Now the rook is off of the e-file. It has become more passive. Another important rule that you have to remember is that if you trade off one of your bishops, in this case, let's say we trade off our dark square bishop, we need to replace all of our pawns on dark squares. So in this position, black only has the light square bishop left. However, we still have to put the pawns on dark squares in order to make this bishop good. Because if we don't do that, and if we continue to put all of our pawns on light squares, this bishop is going to be very, very miserable. Even if we play d5, yeah, this is a variation that you can play, but it is very, very passive for the black pieces. Instead, what you want to do is make moves like castles, and after knight to c3, you can go with d6, and then a couple of moves later with queen e7, you can set up e5. Now you're putting all of your pawns on dark squares. Your pawns are controlling the dark squares while the bishop is controlling the light squares. This is very, very important to avoid weakening your position. Sometimes you can weaken your opponent's position significantly if you trade off his good bishop. So in this position, black has a lot of pawns on dark squares, and what I want you to notice is that this dark square bishop is very, very weak. It's blocked over here. If it goes to f8, it is still blocked. It's gonna take a lot of time for this bishop to get out, and it is very difficult to do so. So in a position like this, that means that for black, the dark square bishop is the bad bishop and the light square bishop is the good bishop. So in this case, we want to trade off our opponent's good bishop. So we play this move, bishop to b5. Now, black cannot avoid this trade because then the rook would be hanging. If the bishop moves away, this rook is hanging on e8. And if something else happens, let's say rook to e7, now we can take on d7, and after black takes back, knight to g3, the light squares are now up for grabs because we traded off the defender of the light squares. Sometimes it's better to lose a pawn and gain control over weak squares rather than be up a pawn but actually lose control. So in this position, one of the best moves for white is to take on c6, and after b takes c6 and c3, just simply guarding the pawn. What I want you to notice is that white is up a pawn in this position but has very weak light squares. Bishop to a6, attacking all the light squares, controlling all of the light squares, and also not allowing the white king to castle. Knight to e7, bishop to e3, both sides just simply developing, queen to b8, and then queen to b3. Queen b8 is a very multi-purpose move. It attacks the pawn on b4, puts pressure on the pawn on e5, and in this position, black is slightly better. So knight to g6, applying more pressure, threatening to win the pawn, bishop to d4, and everything is guarded at first glance, right? Everything is guarded here. What could possibly go wrong? However, queen to b5. This is the cold shower. You weaken the light squares way too much in this position and you try to hang on to the pawn. Now the light squares are very weak. The e2 square is a mating square, so queen e2 would be checkmate. This has to be guarded one way or another, but how do you defend against queen e2? If you go queen c2, you lose the pawn on b4. If you go queen b2, then there's knight f4, knight d3, forking the monarchs. So what do you do here? You can't do anything. The best thing to do is to actually play king to d2 and then go into this position. And here, basically after knight f4, black is going to be getting his material back with interest. And all of this happened because you weakened too many light squares as the white pieces. As I said earlier, if you trade off a certain color bishop, you need to put the pawns on the opposite color. The pawns needed to be on light squares if the dark square bishop is the only one remaining on the board. However, because the pawns were on dark squares, the bishop is a dark square bishop. Who's guarding the light squares? Nobody. And that is why white is losing here. Okay, now let's take a look at this position right here. So in this position, there is no obvious weak square. However, we can actually create one ourselves if we play this move c5. Let's say after c5, this bishop goes back. Now what I want you to notice is that we have more control over the square on d6, and after a move like knight to c4, we're going to have a lot more control over d6. We're also offering a trade of bishops. Once the bishops are traded off, let's say a move like knight to d8 is played, we trade off the defender of the d6 square. Now we put the knight there. Now we got d6, but we weakened d5. This is a very important concept that you have to remember. But in this case, because we have a light square bishop, we can trade our bishop for the knight, while black cannot do the same. Let's say in this position a move like queen c7 is played, we can always take this knight on d5, let's say e d5, we can go rook to e1 here, it is not a problem. We can also go b4 and let's say rook to d8, now we can go rook e1, and now we are completely winning because we're going to dominate the e-file. If the rook sacrifices itself for the knight, now we are up material, we can double up on the e-file and we can create problems for the black pieces. Another way to create weaknesses in opponent's position is to use pawns in order to force out a response. In this position, let's say white plays this move bishop to e2, we can play this very, very nice move pawn to h5. Now, pawn to h5 has a very direct idea in mind. If a move like g5 is played, that weakens the square on f5. So here we can take on d4, and then we can go knight to e7, and then we can put the knight on f5, and now both knights are pressuring this pawn on d4, and this is going to be a much better position for the black pieces. And the thing is, white does not have a good response. White cannot ignore this pawn because we are threatening to take and then win the rook. If the pawn takes back, that would of course hang a rook. And if a move like g takes h5 is played, that doesn't do anything either because f5 has still been weakened. So even taking on h5 does not help white. The only good move as far as I can tell is rook to g1, but if you have to play rook to g1 in this position, now you're not going to be castling over here, and you're also going to struggle to castle queenside as well because of how clunky these pieces are over here, and generally black is going to have a much easier game. Of course, this sort of goes without saying, but you need to target weak pawns in any position. So here, a move like rook to d1 is really good because it attacks the pawn on d6. Let's say black tries to defend, we will pile up pressure and black will try to defend even further. And at some point, we're going to have to use our pawn in order to overwhelm our opponent. And in this case, black is losing this pawn on d6. Now that's if they have weaknesses. In a lot of positions, your opponents will not have clear weaknesses just like this one. And this brings me to this position right here. In this case, there is no clear weakness for the black pieces and for white to utilize. So in this case, we need to create a weakness on our own. We have to play this move a4. Now in this position, let's say rook to f4 is played, we have to guard the pawn, we play f3, let's say g5 is played, and now we go a5. And at this point, black is already feeling some pressure. So in this case, if a move like rook to b8 is played, we capture on b6, we go rook to b1, putting more pressure here. Like rook to f7, we go rook a6, putting even more pressure over here. We go rook b5, not allowing our opponent to push ever, and now we have tremendous amount of pressure on b6. These two rooks are stuck defending this, and our king can go in to go after these pawns over here. We can maybe even walk our king up to this square right here if possible. Most likely not, but if allowed, we can do that. And this is going to be a winning position for the white pieces. That is because we created the weaknesses and we targeted them, and because black has to use his resources himself to stay very passive and defend, we can go in with our king. So in this case, king e7, we go in with king g3. Let's say king to d7, we would go in with king g4. And now how do you defend this? You have to play h6, king h5. How do you defend this? If you defend it with rook h8, you lose b6, and you're going to go on to lose the game. And lastly, we have this position right here. And what I want you to notice about this position is that the square on d4 is very, very weak. However, if we go knight to d4, in this case, the problem is that white will take, and then we have to take back, obviously, and then white will go f4, and this is not going to be a good position for the black pieces. We do not want the pawn to end up on d4. We want the knight to end up on d4. That is why we don't want to play a move like knight to d4. Instead, we want to reroute this knight to e6 and then put this knight on c6. So knight to d8, and let's say queen d2 is played, we go knight e6, and then we go knight to c6. Now, whatever happens, one of the knights is going to land on d4. Let's say a3, white tries to set up some sort of b4. We go knight to d4. Let's say knight takes d4. Now we don't have to take back with the pawn. We can take back with the knight, and we have a classic good knight versus bad bishop scenario. This pawn is under attack, and this is just a fantastic position for the black pieces. If we were to go knight d4 right away, once again we would run into this problem of knight taking, and we don't have this knight to recapture on d4. We have to recapture with the pawn. No matter what happens, we don't get any form of positional advantage here. If anything, white is better after f4, and this is going to be very, very uncomfortable for black. However, if we compare this position to this one right here, this is a much better position for the black pieces. So first of all, this pawn has to be defended. Then we can go b5. And even if white tries to fight back with moves like f4, it doesn't change anything. We still have a very nice knight on d4. We can even capture here. It doesn't really matter that much. We can move this rook to b8. And this is a very, very comfortable position for the black pieces.